Welcome to the deep dive. We've got your materials, and we're ready to dig in, pull out those key insights for you.
Yep, acting as your expert guides.
And today, we're diving into something pretty intense. A transcript from Charles Chuck Casto. He's a real nuclear industry veteran.
Oh yeah, deeply experienced. And, crucially, he was there, on the ground, after Fukushima Daiichi.
His background is, well, extensive. Air Force, nuclear weapons safety.
Nuclear science degree, plant operator, NRC certified instructor, examiner.
He climbed the ranks at the NRC Deputy Regional Administrator.
And then the big one, lead NRC executive over in Japan right after the disaster, then director for site ops.
Wow. And involved in helping Japan rebuild their regulatory body, too.
Yeah, exactly. Part of an OECD mission. Plus, he co-authored a book about the other Fukushima plant, the Aquatini, the one that survived.
Okay, so the expertise is undeniable, and based on his intro, it looks like we're tackling this from two angles today.
Right. First, looking at global crisis leadership more broadly.
And second, zeroing in on the very specific lessons learned from Fukushima Daiichi itself.
And what's really useful is that his insights aren't just from Fukushima. His PhD research looked at a whole range of extreme crises.
Like what?
Well, Deepwater Horizon, obviously, but also major hurricanes, Superstorm Sandy, even going back to 3 Mile Island.
Okay. And he spoke to leaders from those events.
Yep, interviewed people who were right in the middle of it all. Gives it a really broad perspective.
That's valuable. He uses that flat Earth analogy, doesn't he, to talk about how interconnected everything is now.
He does. You know, a crisis anywhere can affect everywhere. Terrorism, global travel spreading disease like Ebola.
Yeah, or those Malaysian airliners. A single event grabs the whole world's attention.
And that leads right into the core problem he identifies.
Which is?
That our current approach to global crisis leadership is, well, it's pretty ad hoc, kind of making it up as we go along each time.
Okay, so what's the fix he's suggesting?
He argues we need to standardize the international response more, make it look a bit more like how countries handle domestic crises.
With common language, common terms.
Exactly, especially in complex industries like nuclear. He saw real differences with Japan, how they measured radiation, the tech they used, even how they designated plants or defined evacuation zones.
Right, things you'd think would be universal in that field.
You would, but they weren't. And he stresses we need to share best practices, especially with countries just starting nuclear programs, and frankly in other tech fields too.
Build that capability before the crisis hits.
That's the idea. Proactive, not just reactive.
Okay, let's dig into that analysis of extreme events. His research, talking to leaders from Deepwater, Fukushima, Sandy. What jumped out as being different on the ground in each case?
Well, what's really striking is how different the core concerns were. Deepwater Horizon, a lot of focus on weak safety procedures, maybe a shaky safety culture.
Right, and getting different companies to cooperate.
And that was a big one too. But then you look at Fukushima. Totally different pressure points. The absolute priority was supporting the workers in just horrific conditions.
Unfathomable, yeah.
And the communication challenges were immense. Just getting reliable information was a nightmare.
So even though they're both huge disasters.
The immediate problems felt very distinct. Although, interestingly, some of the human stuff, fear, trust breaking down, that seemed more consistent.
Okay, so the big takeaway. Every extreme crisis is kind of its own beast.
Pretty much. Which really undermines the idea that you can just have one single crisis leadership playbook, right?
He called the existing theories a Tower of Babel, didn't he?
Yeah, because so many theories come from studying just one event in depth, like Carl Weick's sense-making theory from the Man Gulch fire.
Or normal accident theory, high reliability organizations.
Right. They're insightful for that one case, maybe.
Yeah.
But try applying the Man Gulch lessons directly to a complex nuclear accident. It doesn't always map perfectly.
Leads to a lot of different ideas, but no single unified theory that works everywhere.
Exactly. The Tower of Babel.
So, if the events are so different, what about the leaders? Did his research find any consistent traits needed, or did that vary wildly too?
It strongly suggests the leadership traits needed really depend on the situation. Fukushima was a powerful example.
How so?
The operators there, they really stressed things like the leader's personality, their character. Basic trust was huge. And, of course, their experience.
That personal connection.
Yeah. And he even talks about defiance. In extreme life-or-death moments, sometimes pure survival instinct can override rules or orders.
Like Yoshida and the water injection.
Exactly. Defying the Prime Minister's initial hesitation because, as an operator, he knew what needed to be done now to prevent something worse.
That's a stark example. How did that compare to Deepwater Horizon?
Quite a contrast, actually. On the Deepwater Horizon, a major issue seemed to be inexperience, maybe a lack of deep technical mastery among some key leaders.
The technology itself was too complex.
It seems the complexity of that specific deep-sea drilling operation kind of outstripped the leader's ability to fully grasp it in the moment, which, likely contributed to the chaos and panic.
That's interesting. And what about culture? You mentioned the Japanese operators valuing personality. Does culture play a big role in what kind of leadership works?
That's a really good question. Chuck offered an interesting sort of anecdotal observation on that.
Oh, yeah.
He suggested that when people face that immediate, visceral fear of death, sometimes cultural norms can kind of melt away.
Really?
He pointed to Yoshida again, arguing that his defiant actions might have stemmed less from traditional Japanese culture and more from a universal reactor operator culture. This absolute focus on stopping the meltdown, whatever it takes.
The immediate threat overrides the cultural programming almost.
In that extreme moment, maybe. It's
Yeah.
a compelling thought.
What about the other side of culture, like how we attribute responsibility? In the U.S., there's often this expectation that leaders have total mastery, right?
Absolutely. And that links back to Deepwater Horizon's issues. You had this expectation of control and deep understanding.
But the reality was different.
Right. The person arguably most knowledgeable technically wasn't in the top spot, and there was real confusion about roles and responsibilities. That clashes hard with the cultural expectation of mastery.
And he drew a parallel to Fukushima there.
He did. Yoshida had the deep technical know-how, but the ultimate decision-making power sat higher up: prime minister, corporate leaders who maybe didn't have that same granular second-by-second understanding of the reactor physics.
So a disconnect between knowledge and authority.
In both cases, yeah, though in different ways.
Let's shift gears a bit to emotions. This seemed like a really central finding in his research for extreme crises.
Oh, absolutely critical. He found that as the crisis gets worse and the perceived threat of death goes up, the leader's own felt emotions and how they manage the team's emotions become hugely important.
More so than in, say, a routine problem.
Much more so. He talks about a shift to emotional leadership, points to Masuda at the Daiichi plant, the one that survived, as someone who really led through managing his team's emotions effectively.
And even at Fukushima Daiichi itself.
Yeah, he mentioned an operator in the control room playing that vital role, keeping people focused amidst the absolute chaos.
And this emotional leadership was, what, lacking on the Deepwater Horizon?
Seems like it. A very stark contrast. He described disorganization, people acting purely on instinct.
Like jumping off the rig.
Yeah, and even what he called counter-leadership actions that actually hindered the response.
Like the captain's reaction to the Mayday?
Or the chief mate disconnecting the rig from the well. Actions driven perhaps by panic or confusion, but ultimately making things worse, shows what happens when that emotional grounding isn't there from leadership.
He also mentioned this idea of a threshold of trust changing dramatically. Can you unpack that a bit?
Yeah, it's the idea that, normally we operate with a certain baseline trust in systems, procedures, the people around us.
Okay.
But when you're suddenly facing imminent danger, like your life is on the line right now, that threshold shifts massively.
How?
You become much more reliant on gut instinct. Immediate cues from people right there with you. Trust in, like, distant bosses or complex procedures could just evaporate. You trust what you see and feel in that moment.
So boiling it down, no single leadership style works for these extreme events.
Definitely not.
And that raw fear, the potential for death, it changes everything, decision-making, how people respond.
It fundamentally alters the landscape. Leadership has to adapt to that specific event, that specific emotional context.
Which brings up a fascinating point he addressed. Can you actually train for that? Train instinct, intuition, managing those fear thresholds?
It's tough, right? He acknowledges you could do, and we see it in the military, emergency services.
Right, firefighters, paramedics.
Exactly. But it's much harder in other fields. A key difference is often the core priority.
Mission versus people.
Kind of. In the military, the mission might come first. And there's intense immersive training built around accepting risk, including the risk of death. It fosters a certain mindset, unit cohesion.
Harder to replicate in a civilian company.
Very hard. The primary focus is usually preserving life above all else. The ethical lines are different, and you just can't easily simulate that level of life and death pressure in, say, a corporate training exercise.
He also had a caution about overtraining for heroism, didn't he? Using Chernobyl as an example.
Yes, that was a really important point. He warned against training or encouraging people to take heroic, potentially fatal actions like massive radiation doses, unless it's absolutely clear they are saving lives immediately.
Because a radiation plume is usually a long-term risk.
Generally, yes, a cancer risk down the line, not instant death. So sacrificing lives now for potential reduction in future cancers.
Yeah.
The ethics get very complicated. He argued for strategic thinking instead.
Learning from incidents like Brown's Ferry.
Right. Where a more measured strategic response proved better than immediate, maybe heroic, but ultimately less effective actions. The goal should be designing systems like the FLEX strategies he mentioned.
Those backup systems.
Yeah, the flexible coping strategies. Designing things so you minimize the need for that kind of extreme heroism in the first place. Build in resilience.
Okay, that makes sense. This seems to lead into his integrated theory of extreme crisis leadership. Can you sketch out the main parts of that model?
Sure. He breaks crises down into, like, 3 types: routine, extreme, and dangerous. We're focused on the extreme category here.
Right.
And in those extreme events, the ones with that superluminal sense of potential failure, he talks about, his model highlights 5 key leadership dimensions.
Okay, what are they?
Situational awareness, crisis management, which is more the logistics, the stuff, decision-making, leadership itself, and the big one, emotion.
And emotion is central.
It becomes the driving force, influencing everything else. He suggests leadership in these moments often shifts toward the kind of warrior ethos, driven by instinct, intuition, and that fundamental need to preserve life, sometimes even over the original mission.
Okay, let's pivot to his personal lessons from being there during Fukushima. He outlined 4 main areas: information flow, keeping the big picture, anchoring facts, and decision-making. Starting with information flow sounds like that was a massive problem in Japan.
Oh, huge. He described it as really poor, especially getting information from the Daiichi site up to the decision makers like the Prime Minister.
Why was it so bad?
Well, the site itself was isolated physically and informationally, and initially a lot of the instruments just weren't working. They were flying blind to some extent.
And then the whole world was watching online.
Exactly. First web stream nuclear accident. So, yeah, there's massive global hunger for instant updates, but the actual data just wasn't there or wasn't flowing.
Did the American team struggle with this initially too?
They did. Their first instinct, maybe naturally for engineers, was engineer-to-engineer talk.
Yep.
But the situation was too vast, too complex for that. No single person or even a small team could see the whole picture. He said it took them about 10 days to get a really effective information system going with the Japanese.
10 days is a long time in a crisis like that.
It really is. And in the meantime, they had issues getting clear, contextualized info to the U.S. ambassador. Bits of raw data without context. It led to this whipsawing effect, where the understanding of how bad things were kept swinging wildly, made it hard to advise the White House effectively.
So what was his solution? How do you fix that information flow problem?
His mantra became listen, learn, help, and lead.
Okay.
He felt the initial American impulse was maybe more listen and boss, jump in with solutions, before fully grasping the local situation, the Japanese perspective.
So listen first.
Really listen. Understand the problem from their side. Learn the specific challenges, then offer help based on what they need. And only then, once you've built that trust and understanding, can you effectively lead or co-lead the response.
Makes sense. Okay, second point. Keeping the big picture. He had that Casto pandemonium curve. What's that about?
It's a simple but powerful visual. Imagine a graph. As a crisis starts, one-line tanks, that's reliable information dropping off.
Right. Instruments fail. Chaos.
Exactly. And as that line goes down, another line shoots up that's leadership panic or anxiety. Less data, more fear.
Okay, I can picture that.
So the curve just shows that inverse relationship. When things are normal, lots of data, low anxiety. When things go sideways, data vanishes, anxiety spikes. It captures that feeling of being overwhelmed when you lose visibility.
So how do you manage that? How do you keep the big picture when the data is shaky and panic is rising? He talked about setting the goalposts.
Yeah, this was his key technique for managing the information flow upwards to leaders like the ambassador. It means defining 2 boundaries.
Boundaries.
You define the best worst case, the best outcome you can realistically hope for given the bad situation, and the worst case, the most terrible but still plausible outcome.
Okay, like bookends for the situation.
Exactly. So early on at Fukushima, maybe the best worst was getting water injection stable, no major plume. The worst might have been, say, Unit 2 exploding like the others.
So you give the leader that range.
You give them that range, it frames the situation.
And the idea is don't bother the leader with every little data point within those goalposts.
Pretty much. If new information comes in, but it still fits within that defined range, you don't necessarily need to escalate it immediately. Let the team handle it.
But if something looks like it might break outside those goalposts,
Then you need to pay attention. But first, verify. His advice was, let the data bake. Don't react instantly and get some friends. See if others confirm the reading or observation.
check it carefully before you move the goalposts.
Right. Because moving the goalposts implies a fundamental shift in the situation, and that does need leadership attention. It prevents those knee-jerk reactions, keeps the public messaging more stable.
He had that funny anecdote about using sleep time to communicate the trend.
Yeah, that was brilliant. Very human. The ambassador was exhausted, so instead of complex technical updates, Jock started telling him how much sleep he might be able to get.
Like 20 minutes versus 37 minutes.
Exactly. It was a simple, relatable, even slightly humorous way to signal whether things were generally getting better or worse. A great example of translating technical complexity for a non-technical leader.
Okay, third point, anchoring facts. Sounds straightforward, but he learned something specific from Governor Thornburg at 3 Mile Island.
Yeah, Thornburg, with his prosecutor background, really drilled into him the need to interrogate not just the facts, but the source of the facts.
Question the person giving you the information.
Vigorously. Where did they get it? How reliable is it? Do they have a bias? You need to build your understanding on a solid foundation of genuinely verified information, especially when rumors and misinformation are flying around.
Makes sense. Finally, decision-making. He contrasted the White House desire for an aggressive, comprehensive response with the risks of incrementalism.
Right. His concern with incrementalism, like slowly raising the alert level step by step, is that it can make the public feel like things are constantly getting worse and aren't under control.
Like the INS scale changes at Fukushima.
Exactly. He argued for maybe being a bit more conservative or perhaps setting the initial worst-case goalpost wider to avoid that perception of constantly escalating danger. Be upfront about the potential severity earlier.
He also brought up social amplification of risk. What did he mean by that?
That's where social or political factors can override purely technical considerations. Public pressure, political concerns, they can force decisions that aren't necessarily the optimal technical solution.
Like the Prime Minister stopping the release of slightly radioactive water.
That was the prime example. Technically, releasing that water was the quickest way to help cool things down.
Yeah.
But the social and political pressure, especially from fishermen, was immense.
And that decision had consequences.
He estimated it delayed achieving coal shutdown by about 6 months. It's a powerful example of how non-technical factors can drive decisions in a crisis. He saw similar things in Sandy and Deepwater Horizon too.
So, wrapping up his personal lessons, manage information flow carefully with that listen, learn, help, lead idea. Keep the big picture using goalposts. Anchor your facts rigorously. And make decisions that are decisive but also account for that social amplification of risk.
Exactly. And he stressed the leader staying calm and the value of meta-thinking, thinking about your own thinking process, to anticipate what's needed next. It all comes back to managing emotions, recognizing uniqueness, and understanding how fear changes everything.
The transcript also had a Q&A section with some good follow-up. Someone asked about international standardization for disaster response, inspired by how things improved domestically after Hurricane Sandy.
Yeah, he saw the value in that. Mentioned FEMA and U.S. side on the U.S. side, the idea of maybe taking the U.S. national response framework and trying to adapt it internationally.
Involving the State Department technical experts.
Right. But he was also realistic about the hurdles. Existing international bodies have their own dynamics. There are cultural and political barriers. Some countries might be hesitant. It's complex.
Another point was about the NRC having good relationships, not just with foreign regulators, but with the governments themselves.
Absolutely critical. He emphasized the role of MLEs here. Fukushima really showed that those broader government-to-government connections are vital, not just regulator to regulator.
And it sounds like his ideas, like the goalpost model, are actually being looked at for training diplomats now.
You mentioned that, yeah. Places like the Foreign Service Institute are starting to incorporate more crisis leadership training, and his model is apparently being considered.
There was also a question about timing, balancing the need for a fast, aggressive response with the need to verify data first. That seems like a constant tension.
It really is. He stuck to his principles.
Yeah.
Yes, go big, go comprehensive in your planning and initial posture, but verify before you take drastic, irreversible actions based on a single data point.
Using the goalpost framework again.
Exactly. He gave the example of the doomsday scenario at Fukushima, the fear they might have to evacuate the entire site. The response wasn't to panic, but to proactively focus on ensuring automated water injection would continue, preventing the need for evacuation, addressing the extreme possibility strategically while still verifying the overall situation.
What about the point where the mission shifts? From saving the plant to just containing the damage, Unit 3 exploding seemed like a key moment.
Definitely. He said that was a real point of dejection for the staff, a major psychological blow. The focus had to shift more towards containment and preventing further catastrophe.
Similar shifts happen in Deepwater Horizon towards personnel safety.
Yes, and in both cases, you saw workers taking initiative sometimes, even without direct orders, just trying to fix things or help others.
Which relates to that emergency machoism idea Governor Thornburg warned about, people offering unsolicited, maybe unhelpful solutions.
Right. Chuck agreed with the caution. While initiative is good, training should ideally channel it productively. You don't want people just randomly trying things. They saw some of that at Fukushima, but mostly the trained operators stuck to what they knew.
He shared some powerful stories from visiting Fukushima later, too, the workers who came back.
Yeah, the dedication was incredible. After the initial mass evacuation, so many returned. He mentioned seeing the plant director, Uchida, with his meager rations. The sheer devastation. It really brings home the human element, the resilience of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances.
Even without that intense military-style training we discussed earlier.
Exactly.
Which led to a final question. Does nuclear power need a military-like structure? Should we hire soldiers?
No, he pushed back on that. The goal, he argued, isn't to need soldiers, it's to make the system resilient enough without needing that level of heroic intervention. Better design, FLEX systems, strategic planning.
Strategy over tactics.
His preference, yes. Like water in, no plume out. Focus on the core objectives. He did briefly compare commercial nuclear to the Navy's program.
Navy has a good record, right?
Potentially better safety, yes, but also different cost structures, less complex operations, in some ways, no power grid attached directly to their reactors.
Yeah.
But ultimately, he brought it back to leadership. Even with the best tech, leadership is what resolves these extreme crises.
And that leadership can come from anywhere.
From unexpected places, like Izawa at Fukushima, or the young tugboat captain in The Miracle on the Hudson, or Masuda at Daini, who wasn't initially seen as that kind of leader.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it's clear that global crisis leadership is just incredibly complex. So many moving parts.
Absolutely. Adaptable leadership, managing information, handling emotions, thinking strategically under immense pressure.
Hopefully you listening have a much deeper sense now of the real challenges, but also some potential solutions when these extreme events happen. It's way more than just the headlines.
And it leaves us with the big question for you to consider. In this super connected world, with the potential for these big tech disasters always lurking, how much should we really push for international cooperation and standardized responses? What role should that play in making us all more resilient?
Something to think about. And if you want to dig deeper, you could look up that Harvard Business Review article Chuck co-authored, or maybe explore the principles of the National Response Framework he mentioned.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the intense world of extreme crisis leadership.